Hi, today we're going to talk about one of the texts that I read when I was starting to learn about rhetoric, Wayne Booth's The Rhetorical Stance. In October of 1963, College Composition and Communication published a talk that Wayne Booth had given at their annual meeting. Wayne Booth was a rhetorician and literary critic, and he spent much of his career teaching at the University of Chicago. Booth opens his talk by telling the story of one of his graduate students, a man who had a habit of writing papers that were, in Booth's words, pretentious, dull, and disorganized, no matter what the topic was. One day, this student thought that Booth had taught something incorrectly during one of his classes, and he wanted to talk about what he had gotten wrong. However, Booth didn't have time to discuss the problem right then, so he asked the student to write him a note. Booth says, 5 hours later, I found in my faculty box a 4-page polemic, unpretentious, stimulating, organized, convincing. Here was a man who had taught freshman composition for several years and who was incapable of committing any of the more obvious errors that we think of as a characteristic of bad writing. Yet he could not write a decent sentence, paragraph, or paper until his rhetorical problem was solved. Until, that is, he had found a definition of his audience, his argument, and his own proper tone of voice. In other words, Booth's student couldn't write anything but garbage when he was only reporting on what he knew about the books that he had read. However, when he had a specific audience in mind and a real rhetorical goal to accomplish in his writing, then his writing improved dramatically. Booth goes on to argue that effective rhetorical writing happens whenever writers adopt the rhetorical stance, which, he says, depends on discovering and maintaining in any writing situation a proper balance among the three elements that are at work in any communicative effort: the available arguments about the subject itself, the interests and peculiarities of the audience, and the voice, the implied character of the speaker. I should like to suggest that it is this balance, this rhetorical stance, difficult as it is to describe, that is our main goal as teachers of rhetoric. My own understanding of rhetoric has really been influenced by what Booth says about the rhetorical stance, and I think his insights can be helpful for anyone trying to improve their understanding of writing or rhetoric. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the key points in his talk and see what they mean for us as we try to improve our writing. Also, if this sort of topic is interesting to you, leave a like and subscribe so that you'll know when we release more videos like this one. In describing the rhetorical stance, Wayne Booth says that it's sometimes easier to understand the right balance by looking at what happens when writers get it wrong. And the first imbalance or perversion of the rhetorical stance that he talks about is the pedant's stance. It consists, Booth says, of ignoring or underplaying the personal relationship of speaker and audience and depending entirely on statements about a subject. That is, the notion of a job to be done for a particular audience is left out. So the pedant stance comes from an overemphasis on the subject matter that's being written about. Somebody writing with this imbalance isn't paying attention to their audience at all. In fact, the pedant's first and only loyalty is to the topic at hand. Now, at first glance, that might seem like a really good thing. We're always saying that we just want the facts, and we're always saying that we want people to give them to us straight, but in practice, that might not really be what we're after. Yes, welcome to another video where we will be talking about Wayne Booth's The Rhetorical Stance. I suppose that the question of the role of rhetoric in the English course is meaningless if we think of rhetoric in either its broadest or its narrowest meanings. No English course could avoid dealing with rhetoric in Burke's sense under whatever name, and on the other hand, nobody would ever advocate anything so questionable as teaching mere rhetoric. But if we settle on the following traditional definitions, some real questions are raised. Now, I've said it before, and I'm sure I'll say it again. When you're writing, you really want to pay attention to your audience, and you want to focus on creating the kinds of texts that they will want to read. Because no matter how true or accurate your facts are, if they're not interesting enough to read, they're not going to do anyone any good. So Booth rightly warns against adopting the pedant stance, saying, the writer who assumes that it is enough merely to write an exposition of what he happens to know on the subject will produce the kind of essay that soils our scholarly journals, written not for readers, but for bibliographies. Of course, we could also swing too far in the other direction, and Booth describes another imbalance, saying the second, which might be called the advertiser stance, comes from undervaluing the subject and overvaluing pure effect, that is, how to win friends and influence people. So somebody taking the advertiser stance cares too much about pleasing their audience, and they may, as a consequence, no longer stay completely true to their subject matter. In its worst form, the advertiser stance might say something like, who cares what I'm selling as long as you're buying? So where the pedant bores people, the advertiser panders to them, telling them whatever it is they want to hear, even if it's not really true or feasible. This is a kind of rhetorical abuse I think that we're more naturally inclined to object to. Well, unless of course we're the hapless victims of all that sweet talking. Hey there, hey there, hey there, step right up to learn the newest and greatest way to ace every writing assignment you'll ever get. That's right, folks, A's on every essay without having to write a single word. Subscribe now and you'll receive not one, not two, but at least 3 videos of the highest quality teaching you everything you need to know according to my simple system. These videos are guaranteed by reputable people to teach you everything you need to know. And hey, if learning's not your thing, that's alright, we don't have to do that either. We've still got you covered, no questions asked. As Booth states, understanding the imbalance of the advertiser stance can sometimes get a little tricky. Having told students that good writers always to some degree accommodate their arguments to the audience, it is hard to explain the difference between justified accommodation, say changing point 1 to the final position, and the kind of accommodation that fills our popular magazines, in which the very substance of what is said is accommodated to some preconception of what will sell. In other words, you're writing rhetorically when you adapt what it is you're trying to communicate in order to help your audience see where you're coming from and to be persuaded by what you're saying. But when you're turning your back on what you know is true to say something that you think will just go over well, you've given up on rhetoric and have adopted instead the advertiser's stance. Booth acknowledges that there are other possible perversions or imbalances of the rhetorical stance, and the third one he touches on briefly is the entertainer's stance, which is the willingness to sacrifice substance to personality and charm. Someone writing with the entertainer stance wants admiration and fame. They don't care what they're saying or who they're saying it to. What they really want is to come out looking good in the end. So where somebody in the advertiser stance wants to flatter their audience, somebody with the entertainer stance wants only to flatter themselves. Well, I feel like, I was going to, I don't know. Let's just move on. Obviously, the most important thing to remember from Booth's talk is that it's important to maintain the rhetorical stance when you're writing. Doing so means keeping an effective balance among your audience, your topic, and yourself. That means that you're not really doing rhetoric if all you're doing is dryly lecturing your audience about the facts. Yes, good information is important, but it's not the only thing that matters. If people think you're too boring to listen to, your accurate facts really aren't going to do a lot of good. You're also not really doing rhetoric when you're just telling people what they want to hear. Of course, you need to do some things to make it so that your audience wants to listen to what you're saying, but don't give up your position completely just to make some friends. And of course, don't write just to make yourself look good. That's not what rhetoric is for either. For me though, the most important takeaway from Booth's talk is something that he doesn't really mention explicitly, and it goes back to that story that he opens with, the one about his graduate student. You see, that story emphasizes the importance of having a clear purpose for your writing. Booth's student wrote miserable essays when he thought that his only purpose was to complete the assignment and to show what he knew about a topic. His essays were dull, pretentious, unreadable. He was writing from the pedant stance, and it showed in his writing. He wasn't paying any attention to his audience, to their needs, or to their attention span. When he wrote that note to Booth, though, he immediately had a more energizing purpose for his writing. He wanted to explain to his teacher something that he had gotten wrong. Now that that student was trying to change someone's mind, he had a real rhetorical purpose. He wasn't just rambling on at length about what he knew. He was trying to get his teacher on the same page. Suddenly, Booth's student had to pay careful attention to his audience, and he had to stay true to his subject matter. He wanted to change his teacher's mind, and he wanted to correct an error. In order to do that, he had to maintain the rhetorical stance. Otherwise, his whole effort would be wasted. That is, by writing with a clear purpose in mind, Booth's student had a much easier time achieving and maintaining the rhetorical stance. And as a result, his writing was better than it had ever been before, at least good enough to be worth mentioning at a national conference. And if it worked for him, it can certainly work for you. So write with a purpose, respect your topic, and honor your audience, and you'll see your writing improve immensely. That's what I learned from Booth's talk, and it's something I've carried with me throughout the years. And I suppose that's where we'll wrap up for today. If you've got questions or comments, leave them below so we can address them in the future, and until then, take care. Yes, welcome back. Nope, I'm too enthusiastic.